Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Hunter Merritt, and I am with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Sacramento District. I'm also part of the Silver Jackets teams for California, Nevada, and Utah, and I'm really proud and excited about today's workshop, which is a collaboration with the Nevada Division of Water Resources. I'll just get an audio check from my colleague, Aaron. Aaron, can we hear from you just to say hello? And perhaps if you have video. And you'd have to press *6 to unmute your line, Aaron.
Hear me, Hunter?
There you are. Hello, Aaron. So Erin Warnock and I, and I'll hand over the introduction to her in just a second. Erin is the Nevada Silver Jackets lead. I am Silver Jackets deputy for the Corps of Engineers. If you're not familiar with Silver Jackets, you will be in just a minute because I'm going to give you a little bit of a rundown on that. But I wanted to say welcome to everyone and give you just a bit of an orientation to the web platform that we have. Obviously, COVID has caused us to kind of pivot to virtual on a lot of the things that we would traditionally do in person. This is no different. This is a pivot to virtual as well, but there are advantages. And so with that, the advantage that we have is we have a much broader reach to a whole lot of folks who are all across the nation. And I would like to encourage you, each of you, to maybe introduce yourselves to one another. So I have a little activity for you that you can do while you're listening to me, while you're listening to Aaron. And that is to find a name somewhere in this participant list and introduce yourself on chat. So the way you'll do that is if you hover your mouse to the center of this this agenda, this document that you're seeing right now, if you hover down to the bottom of that, you'll see two icons in the middle, one with a little person with a shoulder, lines on the shoulder, and that is the participant list. To the right of that is a chat bubble, like a cartoon chat bubble. And if you click both of those buttons, you will open up two panels. One will have the list of people who are here today. If you are calling in, it just says call in user. If you called in ahead of time, it will just enter you as a user, and then if you log in after, you're entered twice, once for your audio and once for your video. So that doesn't mean that you can't introduce yourself to call in user number someone. If you're on the phone only, you're not seeing any of this. So I'm really going to encourage you to come over to the WebEx space and watch what we have going on. If for any reason you cannot access any of the WebEx materials and you are on the phone, you are muted at this time. *78 mutes all lines. We'd ask you to stay muted unless you have an urgent question or if there's a Q&A period, and you can unmute your line by pressing *6. The materials that we're showing are going to be available on nevadafloods.org, so it is possible to find those materials and follow along, but that is the least favorable solution. One more orientation item to you is if you navigate to a slide deck and you look to the left, you'll see up and down arrows above and below a number 1 at this time. And above that is a little squiggly that's an annotation, and you can annotate something if we end up having a conversation that requires that. So here's my challenge to you: is you find someone else in this web space and introduce yourself and tell them a little bit about who you are, what you do, and how you found out about this event. Aaron, I'd like to introduce Erin Warnock, and you can do the same over audio. Introduce yourself and welcome.
Hi, everyone. This is Erin Warnock. I'm the State Floodplain Manager for Nevada. I was previously with the Dam Safety Group and part of the initial planning process for this event, and we are really excited to have it all come together. It's been a long time in the making, something that, has never really happened before, where the dam safety folks here at State of Nevada have gotten to do this type of outreach. So we're really excited about that, and thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Thank you, Erin. Okay, so you have your instructions to introduce yourself by chat to one another. You can do a little private chat. and you can keep the conversation up, share what you learned, share what you're watching. If you have questions or comments that have to do with navigating something, please send a private chat to Brent Fetting, F-E-T-T-I-N-G. Brent, can we hear your voice just to make sure that we have audio from you?
You sure can. It looks like I'm unmuted in the WebEx and locally. So hi, everyone. I'm Brent, B-R-E-N-T, if you're looking for me in the participant list for chat. I'll kind of be monitoring the chat and kind of assisting Hunter in facilitating this workshop. I work with Hunter. I'm also a Army Corps employee in Sacramento, helping plan this webinar with folks from Nevada DWR, Dam Safety, as Aaron mentioned. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Hopefully, everybody on the call today also received an invite through your email. I'll be using that just to kind of track some of the attendees. So again, if you've got some questions about the WebEx, let me know. I'll do my best to help kind of in the background, hopefully without goofing anything up or creating any functionality issues.
Excellent. Thank you, Brent. Appreciate it. And I thank you to all of the speakers who are here today. They'll introduce themselves one by one as they give presentations. For anybody who's just coming in right now, presumably you should see an agenda. It says draft, although it's not draft, it's final, because we're here. This is it. You're at the 9 o'clock hour PDT, Pacific time, and we are doing a little virtual networking. We're encouraging participants right now to chat privately to someone you don't know. Introduce yourself, tell them who you are, where you're from. By the end of this workshop today, I will be awarding a prize. We'll put something in the mail just for you, for whoever is logging in from the furthest distance. So be thinking, if you're the person that's logging in from Puerto Rico, you might be winning and you might be getting something in the mail from us. I'll have to get your address. We'll check that at the end of the morning. But for right now, what I'd like to do is move to an opening and welcome slide deck for anyone who may not already be familiar with Silver Jackets. So what I'm doing here is, sorry, here we go. There we go, slide number 1. What we're endeavoring on in Silver Jackets writ large is non-structural flood risk reduction. So rather than building or fixing levees or building and fixing dams, we're building and fixing resilience for communities across the nation, having them be more aware and more prepared and ready to engage and take action for themselves to reduce risk. So Silver Jackets was born out of the acknowledgement from Katrina that several of the federal agencies who had responsibilities needed to be working in more alignment, and that the best way in order to achieve that is to have the states be in front. So Silver Jackets are, in essence, state-led teams that are federally supported. FEMA and the Corps are generally big federal supports, but we have all forms of federal agencies that are involved in all different types of state teams. So the Nevada Silver Jackets team, Erin Warnock, who just introduced herself, is the person that you would contact, and we would be happy to help in any way where a state determines a priority and puts together a proposal. So as I mentioned earlier, my name is Hunter Merritt. I'm with the Corps of Engineers, and I'm here to support the Nevada Silver Jackets team and explain to you that some of these things that we do, if you haven't encountered Silver Jackets, these are small little icons just to prompt your thinking, where if you have I'll use my interactive tool and give everyone annotation privileges at this point. If you have a pointer on the left, so your annotation tool on the left is a squiggly, and if you click that little squiggly, and to the left of that, a vertical black bar top pops up, and then a little right arrow pops up. My name, Hunter Merritt, looks like this. If any of you in this call have worked on any of these and you recognize the cover of any of these, you're invited to put your arrow on top of it. For myself, this was one of the ones that I worked on in Utah, which is the Skull Valley Go Shoot Floodplain Management Plan. So you can do that, and then you can clear your pointer by using the erase button. I'm just showing folks a little bit of how to drive through this. You're probably familiar with the disaster cycle, which is after a disaster happens, we immediately kick into response. After that prolonged response, that 30 days perhaps that you'd have where you'd have the emergency response funding, then you're in a recovery phase. You're working on mitigation when you're not recovering from a disaster, and then ideally you're preparing and training. Today, largely about preparation and training because we're working on emergency action plans and tabletop exercises. So I wanted to point out to you that the idea of Silver Jackets is there in order to support your cycle at any point. Brent, I'm going to do a quick audio check. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you, Hunter.
Okay. I have something happened with my own WebEx. So, Brent, if you'll just make sure if I lose you or if you lose me that you're going to take over. I may even put you in as host. In fact, Brent, can you steal the presenter ball and advance my slides for me? It'd be easier for me if you do that. Thank you. All right, our work in flood is not limited to one of these in the cycle. It is really there to touch points on all of those in the cycle. So Silver Jackets, ideally, I like to say Silver Jackets is about building a team before you need a team. And if you have a need in a particular state or in a particular community in a state for some support, any one of these areas of the disaster cycle can be addressed. So I really want to emphasize that. Brent, do you now have the presenter ball, and can you advance slides?
Yes, I just went to slide 3. You should see education and outreach events.
I can and I do. You're also invited to give or rescind any annotation privileges that I might have given. So other folks, you're welcome to draw. I like this as a sandbox, so people can play in the sandbox. I think nobody here that's on this presentation today would shy away from optimal engagement. So don't be afraid to play with the tools. We're okay with open space playtime. To that end, actually, a lot of what I've been doing, and I think I saw Carlos Rendo on today's call. A lot of what I've been working on is outreach and education, and that includes kids education. That includes K through 12. We developed an educational simulation, also known as a video game, called Nevada Floods, or the Flood Fighter Nevada game. You can find that on the Nevada Floods website. And we're there to do outreach and education, although this year it's going to be really kind of pivoted to virtual in a different way. So we're looking for creative ways to accomplish education and outreach to the end of flood risk reduction through education and outreach. Next slide. Obviously, the Corps and others, we have a lot of data and a lot of tools to gather data. So if floodplain mapping is something that is needed in a community, or if the floodplain maps are old, this is where we can put attention. Next slide, please. We have worked with Nevada and gotten the word out. We've actually helped in trying to use the virtual space to gather historical data on certain areas. Aaron, at the end of this, can certainly speak to some of the other products we've made, but the Virgin and Muddy Rivers have both received story maps. I highlight this because the story map is now the tool that we're using for emergency action plan and tabletop exercises in those communities as well. So you may see a story map if you're engaging with EAP or tabletop exercise. Next slide. We have been working with tribes through the state, and we did some outreach to workshop outreach to tribes in California and Nevada that we're hoping to lead to future projects. The tribal communities are just as much in need as any other community for having that data, having those response plans up to date and ready to go, and being able to act on that, and sometimes maybe even more prepared than others. And so what we have to do is exchange knowledge. We can learn as well as teach, and so coming together in that format. Next slide, please. And this is the purpose for which we are here today. At least our small portion of that in Silver Jackets is to have put together a guidebook for making an emergency action plan. And that was something that was not accomplished by Nevada Silver Jackets per se, but could be used in your own EAP creation or EAP update. Next slide. Once you have an EAP, you may then make a tabletop exercise happen. And we have supported several communities by providing some of the back-end support. Like I said before, we help to create a story map, and the story map is a way in which you can hypothesize a scenario and walk through that. And it's a great engagement tool. So we have experience with that. Next slide. Overall, this is a slide I'm borrowing from Melissa Wymiller, who's another team member. And I want to point out that one project doesn't solve a problem. It's usually a project that leads to a discovery that there's a need, and that need is articulated and prioritized, and that leads to another project. And then that project would then perhaps lead to a third project. And the end goal of this is a highly functional, collaborative interagency team, so that we can be informed and help each other and lift all boats. So I'm really excited about being here to help with that process. Next slide, and I think it may be my last. Okay, yeah, just I wanted to give you a couple of pointers as I'm handing this off to the Nevada BWR Dam Safety Team to do an introduction. The last little thing I want you to remember about Silver Jackets projects, they're state-led, so Aaron's the person you want to talk to. They're shortened projects, usually 1 year to a year and a half. It is not a grant. We don't give out money to other agencies. We're asking for money from our own agency in order to come and lend the technical assistance and support. And it's not used to try to promote how to build a levee. It's definitely aiming at non-structural flood risk reduction. I believe that is my last slide. I want to say thank you very much. If you'll go to the last, I think there is one more last slide that really prompts everyone in this group to use the chat space to pose questions, have comments, share ideas. If you have a project proposal that comes out of the discoveries that we have today, I want you to use the chat space and chat everyone so that everyone gets to see your thoughts. And then we'll circle back, and we're going to try to collect those thoughts. It's going to be really helpful for us as we progress into fiscal year 22 proposals. So 21 proposals were already in the hopper, and 20 proposals, fiscal year 20, you're looking at it today. This is what's happening today. So let's look to the future together. I really appreciate the time. I know I'm a couple minutes over, but I'd like to get Brent, who actually has the presenter ball, to then hand it off to Chris. Am I right?
That is correct. Chris, are you ready to begin your presentation?
Yep. Thank you, Brent. Welcome, everybody. While I get this set up, I'm just going to run through what we have here, Brent, just to try and save a little bit of time. I had a couple of videos, but we did want to mention that this might go a little into the lunch hour. We were trying to squeeze as much as we could to really try and get as much information we could out in 3 hours. So I'm going to run through this. And like I said, my name is Chris Thorson. I'm the chief of the dam safety section here in Nevada. I'm filling in for Keith Johnson, who couldn't be here today. He had a family event come up today, and he's pictured here. So that is not me. And I also want to thank everyone for being here. Also thank all our presenters who are volunteering their time, from the Army Corps to HDR to Gannett Fleming, and to my staff here at DWR. I also want to thank Silver Jackets. This has been a fun learning event working with you guys, and it's I'm glad we were able to make this all work. We've kind of switched from actually trying to hold tabletop exercises in person to now doing this workshop. So I hope everyone on the line gets at least one or two things out of this workshop. So wanted to kind of start off with why we're here, and then kind of go into what our office does in the state of Nevada. We're pretty behind the scenes, and kind of go into who we are and what we do, and really want to open up the dialogue with emergency managers and dam owners and first responders in the state. That's one thing we haven't really done too much here recently, but that's one of my goals, is to really kick this off. And then really we want to know what we can do to help the emergency managers on the line. What can we do to help prepare you for events, prepare for tabletops? So first up, why are we here? There's been a lot of different incidents and failures throughout the world. This probably being one of the most serious, the iron ore tailings dam that failed in Brazil in January 2019, killed over 250 people, and will have decades of environmental cleanup behind it. This really hit home to Nevada because we have many tailings dams throughout the state. And if this happened in Nevada, this is really what we're trying to avoid. And here recently in Michigan, Edenville Dam failed due to internal seepage, a piping failure in May of this year. Fortunately, there were no deaths, and that can be attributed to the emergency action plan. So that's really why we're here. They had an emergency action plan. It was up to date, and they knew who to evacuate. They evacuated over 10,000 homes and businesses, and because of this, not a single person died during this failure and the failure downstream. So what's our goal here at Nevada Dam Safety? Really, we're trying to avoid dam failure and prevent loss of life and destruction of property. We've had failures in Nevada, and we'll go through that quickly and also at the end of this workshop. So we average about 1 to 2 incidents or failures a year. So it does happen, and that's really why we're here. So we have 4 staff at this point. Currently we have 3 and an intern, but we also utilize other staff within the division to really help with inspections and correspondence with owners. We conduct inspections, we review proposed dam projects, all new projects, alterations, and decommissionings. I noticed some of the names on the participant list we deal with pretty regularly through this process. We permit these before they are constructed. We review emergency action plans, including the inundation maps, and then we also collect storage fees. So in Nevada, there's 626 jurisdictional dams that are constructed. There are more than that haven't been constructed yet, but these are just ones that we physically inspect. They include water supply. You can kind of see the list. We kind of cover all corners of dams in Nevada. And then this doesn't include any of the federal dams, which are Bureau Rec, Army Corps, Bureau of Indian Affairs, because they have their own internal dam safety programs. So what is a jurisdictional dam? It's easy. Just remember 20 feet tall or 20 acre-feet of storage. But we also can categorize a dam as jurisdictional if there's a hazard downstream. So it could be 10 feet tall and 10 acre-feet, but have a home downstream. Our jurisdiction. And in Nevada, this is the hazard classification per NAC, or the Nevada Administrative Code, and kind of go through the low, significant, and high hazard. So if you're from another state, some states have different classifications. So low hazard has a low probability of causing loss of life or a reasonable probability of causing economic damage. significant is a reasonable probability of causing one loss of life, and high probability, or a high probability of causing extensive damage or economic loss or damage. And high hazard has a high probability of causing one loss of life. So this is important because we don't take into account what is being impounded behind the facility. So like it says up there, if it's cyanide or tailings or wastewater effluent, we don't take that into account into our hazard classification. And per NAC, we are also required to conduct inspection other people within the division. Significant hazard we do every 3 years, and low hazards every 5 years. We average about anywhere from 250 to about 300 inspections a year that we conduct. So kind of get into emergency action plans. They are required for all significant and high hazard dams throughout the state. At this time, all high hazard dams have an EAP, but they're not all up to date. We are working with dam owners to do that. And significant hazard dams, as of February of this year, we still have 13 remaining, and most of these are local citizens that we're working with to try and help them develop an emergency action plan. Oh, sounds like no one can hear me. Can you guys hear me?
No, we got it back. We got it back. It was just for a hot second.
Okay. I will continue. And at this time, low hazards are not required to have an emergency action plan, but they are encouraged to develop them, but not required. So I know a lot of the mining facilities still have emergency action plans for their facilities, even though they would be considered a low hazard dam per our state law. So failures in Nevada within the last 2 years, we've had 21 Mile outside of Montello, Charleston Dam north of Elko, Washoe Lake here locally in Washoe County, and Echo Canyon outside of Pioche. Washoe Lake and Echo Canyon were not failures. They were just classified as incidents because there was no unintended release of water, which is a definition of a failure. But what that's shown is that we do need better emergency action plans, and they do need to be exercised. We're also raising our expectations on what is required for emergency action plan, and you'll hear from both Noel with HDR and Greg with Gannett Fleming on kind of what emergency action plans are and what we're looking for. And we're also doing outreach, which is part of what we're doing here. We're really trying to get in front of the emergency managers to give them the information and tools they need. So Washoe Lake happened in June of 2018. And a fisherman posted on Facebook a picture similar to what you see here of just a whirlpool upstream of this dam. At noon, we got a phone call that water was flowing around and under Washoe Lake. When we arrived, this is what we saw on the downstream face of the dam, a pretty large sinkhole that was flowing anywhere from 40 to 60 CFS under and through the dam. Fortunately, we were able to save that with the help of a dam owner in the county. We were able to get enough material to save that dam. Another one, 21 Mile failure, which happened at the same time as the Oroville incident. So it was pretty hectic between state of Nevada and California during this storm event. It breached in 2 locations, the center breach and the main breach, and there was an 1.5 inches of rain in 24 hours over about an average of 3 to 4 feet of snow. So when you look at what caused this, it was a rain on snow event. It wasn't what you would consider a 100-year storm event. So it was interesting to try to deal with this one. It was a low hazard dam. There was no emergency action plan. So I think between ourselves and the county and state DEM, we were all scrambling, trying to make sure that no one would get hurt or injured. So here's some pictures after we were able to investigate. So you can kind of see the scale of that failure. It was about a 60-foot tall dam. So it was pretty extensive damage. This is damage downstream. Just took wheel lines and wrapped them around poles. Nice size ice chunk. That was about 3 miles downstream. That ice chunk actually knocked this mobile home off of its foundation. And just the power of water, you can kind of see what it did. these T-posts. And then also with the amount of flooding that was happening in the watershed along with the failure, it did happen to take out highway and then the railroad downstream of the highway. So with that, I think I tried to go quick so we could try and get back on time to give everyone enough time, but I think we'll hold for questions at the end, I think is the plan, right, Hunter or Brent?
Yeah, but I also encouraging people to type what they learn and what they hear that's really intriguing into the chat. And those of you who are speaking, don't be distracted by that chat conversation. My first one was the definition of a failure is technically what you said?
Definition of a failure is an unintended release of water from the reservoir. Release of water.
Great quiz question for my K-12 students. That is quite a picture at the end. That's a different hazard that we have to deal with. But thank you so much, Keith. Brent, once again, my hands are tied in terms of being able to hand off things, so I'm going to really rely on you to moderate this. But I am on audio and I am watching on my personal computer, so go for it.
Well, now that Chris has the presenter privilege, he'll have to pass it to Noel. It's not letting me take it back here.
All right, so Chris, there you go. If you'll just click the name of the person who's speaking next. Chris, thank you so much for your presentation and getting us back on track too.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Well, thanks, Chris. Hi, I'm Noel Laughlin. I am a Senior Water Resources Engineer with HDR Engineering in Reno. Our office here has been involved in dozens of, or preparation of dozens of EAPs across the country and multiple EAPs here in the state of Nevada. And so I'm here to talk a little bit about kind of what's in an EAP. Let's see if we can get this to work here. And let's see if this will actually run.
It's running.
Okay, good. So Chris had shown some pictures of some dam failures. This is one that happened in Texas last year. And so it kind of drives home the point of why we need to be prepared, because you really never know sometimes when a dam failure is going to happen. So what's in an emergency action plan? Well, it's a written document that identifies, incidents that can lead to a potential emergency condition at a dam, like an unintended release. It identifies downstream areas that can be affected by failure of the dam and loss of the reservoir. It specifies some pre-planned actions that can be followed to minimize damage, loss of life, and loss of infrastructure downstream, or even from failure or just misoperation of the dam itself. I think most states require an EAP for dams of various hazards. I think, as Chris mentioned, Nevada requires them for significant and high hazard dams per the Nevada Advisory Code. Most other states have their own guidance, but I think most are similar to what Nevada has, at least the ones that I've worked with. The dam owner is actually responsible for the development and the maintenance and exercising the emergency action plan. There are a lot of guidelines and tools out there to assist the owners and whoever's preparing the EAP for them. Typically, local and state and federal, if they need to be, emergency management folks are engaged in the enforcement and creation of an EAP. There are technical resources and emergency management resources out there that can be tapped into for guidance and technical assistance. And there are also good educational materials, when it comes to the preparation of the document itself. FEMA 64 is a very good guideline, and I've seen most of the EAPs that I've prepared or been involved in preparing follow the general outline in this document. Dam owners are typically the ones who should initiate the EAP process in the case of an emergency. And both the emergency responders and the owners will have to use the guidance given in the EAP. A completed EAP should also be shared with, the emergency managers, the dam safety officials in the state, or if it's a federal agency, and as well as downstream communities that may have to respond to this, and typically things like, state police, fire, departments of transportation, or public works offices. Some of the key points in an EAP, the dam owner is responsible to, ensure that action is taken in a very timely fashion if there is evidence of an impending failure. And a lot of that can include surveillance and notification of the emergency managers that are going to be involved in an incident. Inundation maps are a critical part of an EAP, and we'll have a little bit more discussion about how to read an inundation map later after my presentation. Typically, they include the delineation of areas that are going to need to be evacuated. It usually, depends on the agency. You want to see arrival times of, sometimes it's the first foot of water arrival at a peak time. Sometimes you want to see depths or velocities. A lot of it just depends on how the emergency managers want to have that presented. And here recently, we've seen the proliferation of a lot of two-dimensional flood modeling tools that allow us to prepare more accurate floodplain maps than some of the older just 1D maps or models that were used to prepare these maps. And I think, as was brought up before, public awareness is a component of an emergency action plan success. A lot of people that live downstream from a dam are just not aware of it. They just, until there's a failure, nobody really knows. And public awareness, can really enhance the effective implementation of an EAP in the case we need to do that. Some of the key things that we look for as a triggering event for an EAP can include, on-site observations. If we have, extreme weather event in the forecast, here along the West Coast, we're pretty susceptible to the Pineapple Express type weather events in the winter, where we get a lot of rain on snow events, which can cause extreme runoff. Instrumentation at some of the larger dams, if it has piezometers or if there are seismometers close to the dam. If we are notified that there's an earthquake near a dam, that certainly is going to trigger a lot higher level of inspection of the dam or observation of it. And also, and unfortunately in this day and age, we have to be aware of unusual events such as, terrorism or, an industrial incident. I don't know if anybody saw the pictures of that large explosion in Beirut here a couple of weeks ago. Some of the other important key points in an EAP are notification flow charts and points of contact for all the emergency responders. And then again, kind of one of the other things we're talking about here today is the importance of exercising the EAP through tabletop exercises. as well as updating the emergency action plan. Chris mentioned, the requirements for inspections, as well as, Nevada is now requiring periodic updates of their EAP, and tabletop exercises should be done on a regular basis so that your emergency responders are familiar with the document. Some of the typical components that make up an EAP just include the basic data, which covers, the potential impacted area downstream, just general description, a description of the dam, including, the dam height, the crest length, width, the type of dam, who the owner is. Typically, we'll have a description of where the dam is. Are there instrumentation at the dam that are monitoring it? Are there relief wells or seepage blankets or things like that? It should include directions on how to get to the dam for emergency responders. If there are special access requirements for the dam, that should be included in there. And also, if where availability of construction materials for emergency actions, and hopefully trying to stem a seep or something like that. If there's a gravel pit or something near, some dams actually store material on site just in case they have to use it. So. Usually in an EAP, you have kind of an overview of the EAP, all the steps, the event detection, emergency level, notification, expected actions, and then termination and follow-up of the emergency action. It also identifies the roles and responsibilities with the dam owner, who the first responders are, and then also who the emergency managers are, and it also will give you a level of priority in how the various people are to be contacted to get the word out if there's a pending emergency. Components also include event detection, which, as I kind of covered earlier, can be an observation of someone near the dam. Chris, noted that with the Washoe Dam, that it was a fisherman that noticed some seepage around the dam embankment itself. The National Weather Service provides, forecasts for extreme weather coming up, and again, earthquakes and terrorism events. We also outline levels of the emergency determination, which include non-emergency, potential failure. It looks like, a failure is going to be imminent, and then what to do after that. For all the different levels of notification, there are flow charts, communication flow charts with people's phone numbers or where they can be texted, and then also the level of priority in or who should be contacted first, second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth. So it gives you a really great phone tree on who needs to be contacted. And a little bit more as far as the levels, the emergency levels, there should be a description in the EAP of which one or what the level of emergency is, and kind of the process of who needs to be contacted in an emergency based on one of these levels. It also has guidance in the EAP, or should include information on how to terminate the EAP. And in most cases, this is done by the state or the lead emergency manager on this. But also that responsibility should be outlined in the emergency action plan. It should also have guidance on when the EAP should be reviewed and updated, how revisions should be noted in the EAP, and then also when tabletop exercises should be performed. And then also included in the back are the appendices, which has pretty much all the supporting data. You know, the emergency action plan up front is really what you want to refer to when you're having an emergency. All the other information can be in the back, and it can include, you know, kind of regurgitation of a few of the things that may be up in the front, which can include the contacts list and the notification flow charts. There are also a number of checklists and reporting forms that should be included in there that helps document the emergency, how it was responded to, and then how it was terminated. Should identify resources as far as like contractors, available materials, other emergency responders that can be notified and called on if they need to be. It should include all the maps in the back, the location map, the inundation mapping, evacuation plans. Typically, there will be a few of the plan sheets out of the construction drawings that just give the basic dimensions and characteristics of the dam. There also should be a map in the back that shows all the critical facilities downstream, which include, you know, nursing homes, schools, hospitals, fire stations, you know, public agencies, federal agencies. Anything that would need to be notified first in case of an evacuation. And then also all the other supporting material in back. As we're moving more and more into the two-dimensional world, quite often, you know, the EAP that is resident with the state and the owner will have a copy of the actual model in the back that can be loaded up and be probed to see if there's other results that need to be looked at. So who's responsible for the EAP? Of course, the dam owner and operator, they're responsible for the operations and maintenance of the dam. They're responsible for the preparation of the emergency action plan and its updates and its exercise. They're also responsible for the identification of an emergency in case there is something that's going on out there. The initial notifications to the emergency managers. And then following an incident, they're going to be responsible for the repairs or coordinating getting grants for the repairs. Also in the responsibility chain are the local emergency managers and responders, and that includes the public warning, getting out evacuation notices to the areas downstream and the areas you know, identified in the evacuation plan. If there's going to be you know, shelter needed for people evacuated, that needs to be identified by the local emergency managers. Any rescue and recovery efforts are coordinated by them. And if it's bad enough, you know, the state will work with the governor to declare an emergency. And then also following the emergency, they're responsible for terminating the emergency. You know, I think as Chris touched on, also the state emergency management is responsible for aid when requested or coordinating aid, any kind of specialty assistance, and notification of other appropriate agencies, you know, if there's any kind of special hazard associated with the dam. With that is the end of my presentation, and so thank you all very much for your time and patience.
That's fantastic, Noel. Thank you so much. I'm really glad that the video worked and that people got a chance to see that. Boy, it was quite an eye-opener. The time that we have right now, everyone who's on this should have already received an invitation that had an agenda. By the virtue that you're in this meeting, we assume that you have the agenda because that was the way that you would click the link that got you into the meeting. And what we have is all the way up until 10 o'clock for a break. So what I'd like to do is ask this audience if you would be willing to chat a question or a comment or something that you learned in the chat space, or if you'd like to speak up and introduce yourself, tell us your affiliation, you press *6 to unmute your own line. So let's open the floor for questions for anyone you've heard from this morning so far. Not hearing anything.
Hi there. My name's Donna Beckering, and I'm in New York State. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, yes, we can. Welcome, Donna.
Hi there. I'm the EAP coordinator for our state in New York, and I had a question about the Class A dam that failed. I think it was the 21 mile. Is that going to be reclassified to be a significant hazard dam since it did so much damage downstream?
Sorry, I was unmuting my line. Can you repeat that?
The 21 mile dam, the Class A dam that failed due to heavy snow and rain, as a Class A, and it did do some damage downstream. Is there a chance that you would reclassify that to be a significant hazard dam now since it did so much damage?
So in Nevada, our hazard classification is based off of a sunny day failure. And when we ran internal models on the sunny day failure, it actually didn't impact the downstream facilities or the highway. It just impacted the farm that the dam was supplying water to. So that was kind of it was kind of a very extreme event. Upstream of that dam is about a 700 square mile watershed that all funnels to that dam. And then where the highway is, we actually ran watershed analysis on kind of what actually reports to that highway. And it was over 900 square miles all reported to that highway crossing. So it's in the court system right now between a couple different parties. But I think even if they were to rebuild it, they didn't. They actually stabilized it and just completely removed the dam. I think it would still probably be a low hazard based on a sunny day failure here in Nevada.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for the question.
Any other comments or questions? Janelle Woodward, I see that you're chatting, and I appreciate it. It's great to have you here. Keith, or maybe Chris, you opened this, and you were very gracious to sort of truncate your opening. Were there any points that you wanted to reemphasize, or any parts that you cut out that you can introduce again? Any last thoughts or reminders? Is there anything more that you want to fill in? And you're on mute, possibly locally, if you are speaking up.
Yeah, I was just waiting for it to unmute. I think the biggest thing that we're really trying to get out, and I think Keith Conrad will hit on this at the end, is really just trying to open up the door between our office, state DEM, and the local emergency managers and dam owners to really start building tabletop exercises, really start getting that word out. Because the last thing we want to do is have a dam failure incident in Nevada and everyone's running around in circles, for lack of a better term. But really, we're trying to prepare now so that in the event of an emergency, everyone is prepared and knows who's got to wear what shoes and hats at that time.
Thanks, Chris.
And then
Go ahead.
I was going to say, if you guys haven't watched those videos of those two failures, I did have YouTube links, but just search either one of those failures. The tailings dam is very eerie. It failed at lunchtime when most of the staff was in the mess hall downstream of that dam. So you can actually see quite a few. It's a pretty disturbing video. And then the Edenville failure, it's interesting to watch how that failed. So if you guys didn't or haven't seen those videos, I recommend watching them and kind of see. And then also, I don't know if Greg will hit on it, but there's also a really good site that ASDSO and a bunch of other partners have put together. It's called damfailures.org. Actually, Greg Richards, who's one of the next speakers, helped develop that. But if you're interested about dam failures or kind of consequences to what's happened in the past, that's a great website to go to.
Hey,
That's
Chris,
great.
this is Brent. I saw one of the questions that just popped in to the chat was from Carlos Arendo, a question The Michigan dam failure showed how a dam owner can drag their feet in implementing corrective action to the peril of others. Are there any dams that have that level of associated risk, specifically in Nevada?
Within the state, there's always dams that, there's no perfect dam, I guess, and there's always dams that always require attention. It's always, take dams as like a used car, right? Or when it's first built, it's brand new, you don't have to do a whole lot of maintenance, but then as it gets older, you're going to have to keep doing more and more maintenance and start replacing major pieces, right? Just like a car, you may have to replace the clutch or the transmission or the engine, tires, etc. As the dam gets older, maintenance costs are just going to go up. So a lot of the dams in Nevada are pushing 50 plus years old because they're all built quite a while ago, other than the urban dams. But yeah, there are dams in Nevada that have a higher risk, and that's one of the reasons why our office exists, is to try and identify those and work with the owners to try and limit those risks.
Great, thanks, Chris. Another one came in from, do you have something, Hunter?
Hey, Brent. Yeah, so Brent, if you'll read off maybe one more question, your favorite question that you're seeing built up in the chat, and in the last couple minutes that we have before our scheduled break, which I want to honor because human needs are penultimate, really. Nobody can pay attention if they have to go pee. So if you would maybe read off one more question and get a quick answer, and then we'll take our break. And as we do, I want to just give everybody a logistical update. I'm going to turn off my main computer with which I am listed as the host of this meeting. I'm going to keep my fingers crossed that it doesn't end the meeting at our break, and that Brent will automatically become the host when I log off. I have a frozen screen on my host computer. So I just wanted to give you a warning, everyone, that if things didn't work and you came back from your break and the WebEx had ended, please just reinsert just like you did when you entered at 9 o'clock. And my apologies ahead of time if it doesn't work. My hope is that it won't end the meeting, but that Brent will become the default host. So, Brent, maybe pick one more question, and then we'll take our break, and I'll keep my fingers crossed that I don't end the meeting. Go ahead.
Yeah, you bet. There are a couple questions that I think might be answered by future presentations, or actually would be really good topics for our closing thoughts and Q&A at the end. So the one I'm going to pull up here is from John Wettenkamp with the National Weather Service. He was wondering how often do you interact with your local NWS office? So Chris or Keith Conrad, I think this might be targeted to you as dam safety staff in Nevada. Specifically, do you know your local service hydrologist, hydrology program manager, or warning coordination meteorologist?
So this is Chris. I'll take that question. We, in the last couple of years, have been really working hard with the Reno office here to try and get those contacts built up between the Elko National Weather Service and the Las Vegas offices. So we have been working with the Reno office to start that, and I believe all the National Weather Service local offices should have copies of all the emergency action plans electronically. And the hope is that as these tabletop exercises start kicking off more and more, that the local National Weather Service offices would be invited to these to help fill in those blanks, because they are a vital role in emergency preparedness and notifying dam owners in the communities when flood events may happen. And then also after the fact, because they have the capabilities of sending out mass notifications of when a flood is happening. I know in 2017 there were quite a few text alerts that came out after not only 21 Mile, but some other small incidences here in northern Nevada locally. So to answer that question, we were working on it, but we were really working on it with the Reno office at this point.
Thank you. This is perfect segue to our break. We're going to do a quick 5-minute human needs break. We're going to get queued up. Again, I'm going to try to log off, but if it, for some reason you get kicked out, please do come back. And really, thank you all for being here. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Noel. And thank you, everyone, for participating. Okay, well, 10:05, we'll be back together. 10:05 Reno time. Greg, just so you know, we can see your slide and we could see your video there just for a sec, so you're all queued up.
Thank you. Can you hear me as well?
Yes, sir.
Awesome.
Okay, here we're coming up on the 10:05 start time, and I also want once again to encourage folks to introduce yourselves to one another, find someone that in that participant list with whom you're not familiar, and introduce yourselves so that we're kind of building community here. My name's Hunter Merritt, for anybody who's joined after we got our start at 9 o'clock this morning. But we are staying on our schedule. Our agenda that was sent with the invite should be something available to you all, and that indicates that at 10:05, we're back together to hear from Greg Richards. So here we are. Greg Richards, are you with us? Can we hear you?
Yes, I'm here.
Fantastic. Welcome, and take it away.
Awesome. I appreciate it. I appreciate the chance to participate today, and the things that both Chris and Noel have shared have really set the stage for me, so I appreciate their input. So I am Greg Richards. I'm a dams and hydraulics engineer with Gannett Fleming, and I work out of our Salt Lake City, Utah office. We do dam work cradle to grave, essentially, from building new dams to design and rehab of existing dams, decommissioning, emergency action, planning services, the whole ball of wax. So I have been exposed to a wide number of things over my career, but emergency planning is one thing that I've been heavily involved in, especially developing breach inundation mapping, which I would consider one of the most important parts of an EAP. I don't think you can choose a most important part, but it's a critical component of that plan. So to start out, I want to, let's see if I can get this to go. Okay. I want to talk about the purpose of EAP inundation maps. And this is the definition that's in FEMA P946, which is the document FEMA's prepared that kind of outlines how to develop inundation maps, what should be included, et cetera. It's a great resource. But essentially, they boil it down to this. The EAP map should assist the dam owner and emergency management authorities with identifying critical infrastructure and population at risk sites that may require protective measures and warning and evacuation planning. So that's the purpose of these maps. And that makes sense. That lines up well with the purpose of an EAP. And that, as we talk through, what these maps include, this is kind of the view we're looking at them from. But before we get to, I guess, all the nuts and bolts of what's on a map and how to read it, I wanted to walk through a few case studies of dam failures and talk about specifically the flood wave that resulted from those failures. So the first is South Fork Dam. This is not to be confused with the South Fork Dam near Elko that I've recently had the chance to work with Chris and the other folks at DWR on. This is South Fork Dam near Johnstown, Pennsylvania, and it failed in 1889 and remains to this day the most deadly dam failure in U.S. history, with over 2,000 fatalities. And I wanted to read an excerpt from this book by David McCullough. It's called The Johnstown Flood, that talks about some of the history of what led to this dam failure, and then also the actual failure itself and the aftermath. But in this book, he describes the breach wave. He says the wall of water swept through in such a way that it left almost nothing to suggest that there had ever been such a place as Mineral Point. The town was simply shaved off, right down to the bare rock. And now I'm going to continue from the book. The water moved straight on down the valley, picking up a little speed wherever there were fewer turns, to eat up its momentum, and slowing down wherever the course began twisting again. Estimates are that in some places it may have been moving as much as 40 miles an hour. What is more, its overall rate as advance was extremely fitful. The wall of debris and water came on not steadily, but in an irregular series of thunderous checks and rushes. At times, eyewitnesses said later, the debris would even clog the path enough to bring the whole thing to a momentary standstill. All the crushed and tangled sweepings from the dam would walk clear across the valley, seeming almost more than the millions of tons of pressure from behind could budge. But then the whole seething mass would burst apart with trees and telegraph poles flying into the air as though blasted by dynamite. And the water would rush forward again even faster, and as it moved on, the water kept tossing logs and roots above its surface, as though the whole mass were full of life. He goes on to describe how the bottom of the flood wave moved slower than the top because of the friction and the debris, and it created this downward pressure, just a crushing wave that moved along the valley at an immense speed. It's hard to imagine, but I share this to know we're not talking about a 100-year flood. We're not talking about some flood that spills beyond the banks. These can be extremely violent and powerful events, and they're very complex as well. On the flip side of that, here's a shameless plug I threw in for damfailures.org. You can learn more about this incident and others at this website that's hosted by the Association of State Dam Safety Officials. It's a great resource, and we do have several pages on the site dedicated to emergency response and planning. So I'd encourage you all to check that out. And I believe Keith threw the link up in the chat as well. But on the flip side of that, I want to show this video from the Edenville Dam that was talked about earlier. This is the moment the dam failed. You can see, it's a much more recent event. Obviously, as Chris noted, the emergency action planning helped with evacuation, and we have made some definite advances since the late 1800s when South Fork failed. You can see the water start to gush forth here, and eventually, this is what is the end result. The entire dam embankment is eroded away. The reservoir's been released, and the downstream area has been flooded. It caused overtopping and failure of another downstream dam, Sanford Dam. But I want you to note the difference here. Look at the flooding conditions. I just described what happened with Johnstown, with debris that was smashing and moving at 40 miles an hour, versus this type of flooding, which, I don't want to belittle what happened to them. It's definitely a serious event and caused millions in damage and caused a lot of hardship for many people. 10,000 people were evacuated, but no fatalities occurred. And I think if you look at the flooding, it's not just the emergency action planning that caused no fatalities here. It's the fact that the flood depths and velocities are relatively small. And so I share these two examples just to illustrate the range of events we're talking about when we're talking dam failures. And these maps that we're creating should be able to help us understand what floods are going to be more like South Fork Dam in Pennsylvania and what's going to be more like the Edenville Dam here. So a few insights from these past failures. It's not an exact science. There's definitely uncertainty due to all sorts of things. This is another one that Chris shared from 21 Mile Dam. You can see the railroad embankment must have overtopped and failed. That impacts the flooding extent. That would be a renewed, almost a mini dam failure that would cause a renewed surge downstream of this structure. So there are things like that that our models may not capture. And so there's a lot of uncertainty with these complex events. Second, we can't foresee the future. There's so many variables that could influence the flooding limits. One example is the sunny day failure, which Chris alluded to is the basis of hazard classification in Nevada. versus a flood failure. Oftentimes on inundation maps, you'll see sunny day or fair weather failure called out, and then you'll also see an inundation area for a flood failure, a wet weather failure, PMS failure, probable maximum flood. All of those are essentially meant to represent a scenario where downstream, prior to dam failure, there were already wet conditions. The floodplain was already starting to fill up, and then the dam failed, causing even greater flooding. So that's one way we try to account for it in maps, is we put multiple events on there and kind of try to bracket. The dam failure could cause anything between sunny day and this PMF failure. Other things you might see on maps are location of the breach. So this graphic here on the right shows it's a almost 20-mile long dam in Florida. It's essentially a ring dike, and it's so flat there that if the dam were to fail in any given spot, the flood wave would go an entirely different direction. So this is a case where they have an EAP with multiple maps, so they're prepared to respond on where the failure would occur. Similarly, what structure occurs. So at Oroville Dam, they had an inundation map for dam failure. This is the largest dam in the country. But the spillway, the 20-foot tall spillway, was actually what was at risk. So they ended up evacuating almost 200,000 people when in reality a lot less population was at risk. These are the types of things we try to accommodate in an EAP, try to plan for, to include maps that encompass all these different scenarios so that we can respond accordingly. The third thing is that I want to highlight from these past failures, and I already spoke about it, but the depth, velocity, as well as timing information that I'll talk about in a little bit, can be very, very helpful in evacuation planning. These are some plots from an old Bureau of Reclamation document called ACER 11 that was developed in the 80s, but they included some, hazard zones for different types of people or structures. So the top one here is for mobile homes. So based on a certain depth and velocity, you could say, yeah, if it's less than a foot, it doesn't really matter what happens. The mobile home is going to be safe. But if it gets above that, you start getting into judgment or danger zone. They have plots like this for adults, for children, for vehicles, for homes on foundations, to kind of help you gauge, given the flood, the actual flooding that we're anticipating, what is that danger? Do I need to be evacuating these people first, or should I look maybe downstream and maybe there's people that are more in that high danger zone that I should worry about first? So that is all helpful information in your planning efforts. So now we've talked about historical events and kind of the range of events that we could be dealing with, but now I want to talk about how we actually put these on a map, because in most, if not all cases, the dam hasn't actually failed. We don't know where the water's going to go. And so we have to use different techniques to estimate where the floodplain will be, and typically that's done using a computer. If you go old enough, you might find some that are estimated by hand and look similar to this graphic with, just a fairly coarse map with an outline drawn around it. That may be as good as you get. Back in the 70s, they started using a DOS program called DamBreak that would, simulate the flood routing through a downstream reach. In the 80s and 90s, we started getting a lot more sophisticated and using what we term one-dimensional models. These are models that use just cross-sections at various points in the floodplain to route the flood downstream. Our maps started getting a little better. Might be on a USGS topographic map or something like that to show the inundation limits. And you might start seeing information like the time of arrival or the max stage or things like that. You see, these maps were developed in 2004, so I don't think it's unreasonable to expect that many of the EAPs you see or that you may have on hand may still have maps that look somewhat like this. But then, just as Noel alluded to, just in the past decade, we've seen significant advances in our ability to model the hydraulics of a downstream floodplain using what we call two-dimensional models. And these are just a few examples of the models that might be used to develop these kinds of maps, but they're able to simulate the complex flow patterns that you would expect in a dam breach event a lot better than the old one-dimensional models. You can also glean a lot more information from them, such as pinpoint velocities at specific structures, and you can map the depth across, the entire floodplain, et cetera. So we're seeing a large movement towards using these two-dimensional models for dam breach analyses and then for the subsequent mapping. And a few examples of these, this is a dam in Hawaii up on the hill here, and we simulated failure of this, but you can see what we can do with a two-dimensional model. We can model individual structures to see, if those structures stay in place, how they might impact the water moving around, what's the velocity at those structures, would they be impacted at their foundation. You can also see the flood depth plotted across this whole area. So, all these areas would show up on an inundation map, but the hazard here, where your flow depth is 0 to 2 feet, is relatively small compared to the areas here where you're getting the higher, 8 to 10 to 12 plus velocities. So that's one example of the power of a 2D model. Let's see if I can get it to progress. Okay, here's a video of the kind of output that we get from a two-dimensional model, and this kind of takes it the next step too. Besides just creating an inundation map, we've been seeing dam owners and agencies that regulate dams move towards, incorporating videos such as this based on our two-dimensional modeling into their EAP exercises. You get a lot more from watching how this floodplain moves and develops and how certain areas are cut off first rather than after others. And so there's a lot of information as far as what you can do with developing videos with these two-dimensional analyses. And so with that, I guess we've kind of talked about the range of events that you might expect due to a dam failure, as well as how we're simulating that with our computers. It's not an exact science. There's a lot of uncertainty behind it, but we tried to develop a relatively conservative estimate of where water could go during a dam failure. That's typically the approach we take when developing these maps. I now want to walk through actual inundation maps and talk about how these maps are developed, what kind of contents or items are included on the maps. I'm using modern examples, examples that have been developed in the last few years. It's true that there may be maps out there that don't look this nice or don't have all this information, but the idea is that as we move forward, more and more EAPs should have this type of information in accordance with FEMA recommendations and other state guidelines. So this is a typical inundation map. In most cases, I see the inundation maps include some kind of index map. It has an overall view of where the water would go and the different map panels that might be included with the map set. And so here you see numbered rectangles to represent individual maps in the map set, so that if you're interested in looking at a specific area, you can jump to that area. It'll include typically an overview of the inundation limits, as well as important notes about what assumptions were made during the modeling. During an emergency, it's not likely that you're going to come down to the fine print here and read all the different, things that are said. You're just going to be looking at what areas we need to evacuate. But these, notes and other things have important information on them to help you understand what is actually on these maps. So I'd recommend that you look at that information in your planning efforts before an emergency occurs. I also wanted to talk about inundation extent. So when I say extent here, I'm not talking about, how wide the floodplain is. I'm more talking about where the downstream limit of or extent of the mapping is. And recommendations are that you take, it varies state to state, and federal agencies all have different ways of doing it, but typically you should see your map going to a point where downstream of that point there would be no more risk due to failure of the dam. And again, there are different ways to do that, but if you're looking at an EAP map and you see that your mapping cuts off, a mile upstream of a very populated area, that might indicate that you need to, that these maps should be reevaluated, and that downstream area with more population should be considered. And I've seen many maps that the old maps that they just took it to a point and cut it off. In addition, if you see your mapping continuing down and you're still seeing an increase in depth of 20 feet at the downstream end due to failure, that might indicate that the map should be extended further. Moving to an example of an individual panel, this is a case where, again, we have kind of a mini index map here on the side so you can orient yourself and see where you are. But then you get much more detailed view of what kind of flooding could be expected. So typical information on these individual panels, again, we typically see aerial imagery base map these days, and typically you want to use a recent aerial image so that you get the most recent developments and other things in your impact zone. You'll see inundation limits for multiple failure scenarios. So in here we have the sunny day breach, which is highlighted in light blue. We have the PMF breach, which is highlighted in purple, and then in this case we ran kind of an in-between flood in the darker blue that shows, if it's not an extreme flood, it might be something more like this. We also like to highlight structures or communities at risk. Now, if you have a lot of structures, a lot of homes in your inundation area, you might not highlight every single one, but at least draw attention to those areas that are at risk. And Noel talked about this, but we like to highlight critical infrastructure, so places like law enforcement, hospitals, fire stations, schools, evacuation centers, all these types of things that would be critical to know what's impacted during a dam breach event. I've also seen states that require, Pennsylvania, for example, requires maps to include traffic control points and traffic routes to facilitate traffic flow during a dam failure event. And then last but not least, you typically get information about the flood, and this can be very helpful in determining what kind of flooding is occurring at different hazards. This is a case where we've actually got individual buildings and structures highlighted in yellow for the entire floodplain. And then at different points, so at 6 miles downstream of the dam, at 11 miles downstream of the dam, we have information such as the max elevation, max depth, max velocity, and information about the time of arrival, etc. I want to talk about those in detail here. Again, inundation extent is just the outline. This is the area we would expect to flood during this specific scenario. So it's not perfect. It's probably wise to go a little beyond that in developing your evacuation zones, but we try to be conservative in our assumptions. things like flow depth. This is something that two-dimensional models are really helping us further. Before it was just an outline of area flooded. Now we can develop maps that show where the depths are the deepest and where the hazard is the greatest, such as this one, using some kind of color scheme. And again, just to highlight, the depth here, the hazard here is a lot different from something a little deeper, or you can get even deeper. It makes a difference in the hazard, just as velocity. Here we have a relatively low velocity. Compare that to something like this, the hazard is, immensely different. And that leads to some maps even mapping a variable called depth times velocity. So essentially, we're multiplying the depth and the velocity to identify areas that either have great depth, great velocity, or both to kind of figure out where the critical area is. And that's a trend we've seen in recent years. And last but not least, the timing variables. Very important information in developing emergency planning. We've seen things like this where we're mapping on an index map the arrival time of the flood wave to kind of break it down, big picture, and help people understand how long they have before the flood wave gets to certain points. And then also that timing information can be included on each individual panel. Time of arrival, time of peak. Again, arrival time is important, but the maximum extent wouldn't occur until that peak. And so it's important to distinguish between those. In this case, for the PMF event, the arrival time is 16 hours different. And so in planning, it's important to consider those timing variables. So that's in short my thoughts on how to read an inundation map. I have just a few last takeaways. Recommendations. Don't wait until a crisis to study your inundation maps. It's important to understand not only the scenarios that are plotted on a given map, but also understand the flood severity and in those different areas, and understand which areas are most at risk downstream of a dam to help inform your evacuation plans. The second thing is to be aware of development in or near the inundation zone. I can't tell you how many times I've been in an EAP exercise, or I've been talking to a client and looking at maps, and they say, well, that's not right. This mobile home park isn't there anymore. Or, there's a new subdivision in this area. There's continued development, and so the risks are constantly changing. Other things like new bridges, if there's a new bridge with a large highway embankment, that can drastically impact where floods go and how the flood plain would be upstream and downstream of that structure. So be aware of development, and it's also a reason to be, continually improving EAP maps. I think FEMA recommends they be updated every 10 years, just so we can, not only account for development, but also get the benefit of our new methods that help us estimate flooding limits. So to conclude, dam failures are high-risk, complex, dynamic events. There's a lot of uncertainty associated with them. But ultimately, inundation maps are tools that help us understand both that risk and the uncertainty associated with these events. So hopefully they can help us plan and respond efficiently during an emergency. And that's the end of my thoughts.
Greg, thank you so much. This is great information setting us off on the path to understanding what to do with the information that we've gathered. It's obvious that there's a lot of effort just to go into getting the information and then making it sing with geospatial representation. I really like the interactive piece of the flow mapping as you watched it go. I'm glad that the digits worked across the WebEx. I know it was a little bit choppy to watch that. But I do think that it's great to be able to see it and see it move and not just have the stagnant thing. So it's cool to see the progression of our technological abilities. Are there any urgent questions that anyone wants to ask right now for Greg as we hand off the presenter ball to our next speaker, Jason Sheely? Does anybody want to star 6 and speak up, introduce yourself, and ask a question, or is there a chat question? And by the way, I pasted the agenda in the chat as well. Brent, do you see anything? Or Greg, do you see anything in the chat?
No, nothing right now that hasn't been answered, save a few that are good for the end of the workshop. Otherwise, we're good to roll with Jason if he's ready to go.
Yep, okay. Jason, it looks like you've already stolen the ball, and that's fantastic. A WebEx expert already. So for anybody who's new in WebEx, by the way, there's lots of ways that you can engage with this content. So you can, as a participant, you can change the view any way you like. If you have any questions on how to do that, post them in the chat, and we'll try to walk you through it. At this point, we're viewing Jason's screen, and I'll get you to give me a hello and make sure the audio is working.
All right, hello.
Hey, Jason, welcome. Glad to have you here. This presentation and all the other presentations are available in this WebEx that you can navigate to, although Jason's sharing his screen at this moment. And this is also available on nevadafloods.org. So for anybody who's trying to get to the content, those are two places you can get. Jason, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Hunter. Yeah, so as way of introduction, I'm the Assistant Director of the Corps of Engineers Modeling, Mapping, and Consequences Production Center. And one of our missions as a center is to support dam breach analysis and emergency action plan map development for all of the 700 plus structures in the Corps of Engineers dam portfolio. So that's kind of where I'm speaking from. The main thing I want to share with you today, make sure everybody's aware of, is some policy changes we're going to very soon be making in the Corps of Engineers with respect to our emergency action plan maps for dams, and then also some capabilities that we'll be deploying about a year from now that will be available for Corps of Engineers dams to support incidents and exercises, but could potentially also be leveraged for other dams and other purposes. So mostly demonstration. But I'm going to start off by summarizing a little bit of the policy change for you. So we're going to be releasing a policy document called an Engineer Circular. We're going through the final stages of review prior to publishing right now, so it should probably publish in the month of September or early October. It addresses emergency action plans and inundation maps with a little bit broader scope than just the EAP maps for dams, and I'll talk more about that throughout the course of my presentation. So kind of reading this, 3 things you need to know about our 2 different policy changes from right to left. I want to be clear with everyone that the emergency action plan policy is specifically targeted to Corps of Engineers operated and maintained dam and levee systems. So people like levee sponsors or sponsors of dams that were maybe constructed by the Corps of Engineers but then turned over to a local sponsor, these EAP requirements in our policy don't apply to those types of projects. We are going to be sharing emergency action plan maps publicly through the National Inventory of Dams. So if you're downstream an emergency manager that has struggled with getting easy access to Corps of Engineers EAP map products in the past, that is about to change. Our policy of making those maps for official use only is changing with this policy update I'm talking to you guys about. And then when I talk about how the National Inventory of Dams is going to function, you'll see how you can kind of serve yourself and go get the data that you need for your particular jurisdiction. Other than that, this emergency action plan policy was last spruced up and published in 2018 and no other significant changes. On the inundation map side now, I've already mentioned the sharing with the public. The scope, like I said, is broader than just dam and levee structure emergency action plan maps. It's most inundation map products produced by the Corps of Engineers for multiple different programs. And then through my demonstration, I'm going to be kind of showing the capabilities that we're in the process of standing up, but we're designating some authoritative sources for Corps of Engineers EAP map and inundation map products more broadly. So the National Inventory of Dams and National Levee Database for Dam and Levee Systems, and then a site on the bottom called Access to Water Resources would be the site people would go to look more at like flood event or floodplain mapping in general, which again, many programs in the Corps of Engineers either produce those types of maps or provide technical assistance for productions of those types of inundation maps. So before I get into my demonstration, I'll talk just a little bit about timing of the rollout of the capabilities. So all this obviously tied a little bit to the timing of the publication of the policy document, but reading from bottom to top, we're targeting the public release of the National Inventory of Dams in November 2021. In October of this year, so just maybe a little over a month or 6 to 8 weeks from now, we'll be making this capability in the National Inventory of Dams available to everybody in the Corps of Engineers. So it'll be kind of a year plus or minus of our internal effort in the Corps of Engineers for everybody to review it, understand what the capabilities are, how to communicate those capabilities to stakeholders and the public, and then do some data cleanup activities that obviously we need to make sure all of our emergency action plan maps are in good shape and up to current standards before we release this product in November of 2021. So none of that timing changes the fact that as soon as the policy is published, we should be making, those EAP maps accessible to the public and much more easily accessible to downstream emergency management authorities or state emergency management offices through just points of contact at the various district offices. All right, so I mentioned the National Inventory of Dams. Here's a screenshot of what that home page will look like once it's deployed to the public in November of 2021. I should mention here, because I might forget to mention it later, all of the capabilities I'm going to share with you guys about Corps of Engineers emergency action plan maps are being deployed in a way that any dam with a record in the National Inventory of Dams could leverage this capability. So a dam owner or regulatory agency could voluntarily choose to make those maps available through this system and leverage the capabilities I'm about to demonstrate. This is a new page showing content and highlighting content of what will be available for a Corps of Engineers dam. So I'll mention a few things that are additional information that goes above and beyond a standard national inventory of dam data content and will only be available for Corps of Engineers dams when it's first deployed. So this project description section. Structure information is pretty typical already in the National Inventory of Dams. The risk information, the risk assessment date information, that will be specific to Corps of Engineers dams, but then the operational status information is going to be made available for all dams that are state regulated and federal regulated in that 2021 timeframe. And then this other information, just to give you a feel. Off to the right is a placeholder for where the emergency action plan maps will show up for the Corps of Engineers dams. The concept that we're implementing right now is just a very simple kind of Google Maps level of skill set required to view the basic bottom line emergency action plan map, maybe with not all the bells and whistles that were demonstrated in that last briefing, but just kind of that bottom line depth map, extent map type presentation of some key scenarios for the project. But then as people want more information and they ask for the link to the more built-out map viewer, they would get a screen that looks very much like this. Again, I'm going to go into demonstration mode here for a second, but I want to point out that our policy isn't just that we're going to provide hard copy or web browser type access to maps. We're actually going to give everybody access to the underlying data So if you wanted to, you could, for this particular scenario, for this dam breach, download the underlying depth map in a GIS format, raster format in this case. Or if you're doing more web-based type mapping applications in your state emergency management office or county EOC, you can just grab a map service link right here. So I'll demonstrate that here in a moment. Talking about the capability, people need to post their information. So if you're in a district office or you're with my center, the MMC and the Corps, or you're an external user that might want to leverage these capabilities voluntarily in the future, this just gives you a sense of what kind of the data upload screen is going to look like, just some basic descriptive information about the dam project and the scenario that's being uploaded, and then you click on the Add Data link and browse out to a file and click Submit. So it's pretty similar, a pretty simple web-based file transfer type screen. Really boring to demonstrate, so I'm just going to flash the screen to you guys and then move past it. So where I'm going now is I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about the system that we use in the Corps of Engineers to archive and stack up all of our inundation maps. And then I'll shift over to some dissemination topics. And when I use that term dissemination, I mean examples of things that are accessible to people outside of the Corps of Engineers through this system. So I'm going to start off with a brief little video, and I'll just pause it from time to time. So this screen shows you the content of a database that we have. Oops, apologize for that. Let me go back. And I know some things can be herky-jerky in WebEx with videos, so I'll do some pausing and explaining what you're looking at. So these little icons show where we have what we call inundation map libraries in the Corps of Engineers, probably 1,000+ libraries available at this point in time. 700+ of those are dam breaches, but we have hundreds of other types of inundation map libraries as well. Anywhere you see one of these blue icons with a number, that's just indicating that there's a cluster of map libraries available. And so when I click on this one, you see a list that we can pick from. We have many different programs, like I mentioned, under this policy to make their inundation maps accessible through this system once it's published here in the next month. I'm going to pick most of my time going into some dams, since this is a dam safety audience. But I want to make the point right here that within the Corps of Engineers, we really don't treat our dam break EAP type scenarios all that much differently from any other form of inundation map. There are some, the arrival time and some of the information, like you heard in the last briefing, that are a little bit different. But for the most part in the Corps, we're treating all inundation maps essentially the same. The dam break EAP type maps are just a particular type of scenario with particular assumptions that are made, around how a structure would operate or not operate, given a certain amount of inflow to the project. So moving on, just some quick examples of different types of projects. This is a flashy small stream basin, and you just see increments of 1 foot of flooding tied to the stage of the gauge that exists and that the USGS has for that particular system. Now I'm moving to what we call the Core Water Management System, and I will pause here in a second. So this is the system that our water managers and the Corps of Engineers use to simulate flooding and do reservoir operations. So we have 201 basins around the Corps of Engineers that we're developing this system for. We're in full coordination with the National Weather Service and its National Water Center on how to integrate these inundation map products into the National Weather Service's inundation map capabilities that are being developed. And this, in this case, a one-dimensional type model is being used, but the geometry of that model, so some of these lines and the light blue box, that geometry is really critical to understanding the scope of this particular model and how it can be plugged in with other inundation maps from other sources to generate the most authoritative source. But as I push play, we'll turn all of those model geometry type layers off that only the experts need to see, and we get to a much simpler presentation of the depth map. So in this particular basin, this is a scenario that was used to calibrate the model. It's simulating the extensive flooding that occurred during an event in the May of 2007. Very typical use case in an exercise or when coordinating with a downstream community about a flood, a dam break type of situation is, how much worse would that dam break be than my recent extreme flood event that my community experienced? So I just turned that on. I'm not going to go back in my video, but you see the extent of the dam break and how it's greater than the extent of that May 2007 event. So very useful for an exercise and for planning purposes. Okay, so moving on, I'm actually going to move off of this video I had prepared because we have some other events going on. So I'm going to switch over to a live system. Guess I'll ask for verification from somebody that's unmuted that you can see the website I have in front of me now.
Sure can, Jason.
Okay, great. So inside of the Corps of Engineers, this is accessible to everybody that's a Corps of Engineers employee now. What I've brought up is the Smithfield Dam. So this is the dam here that I'm hovering over with my cursor. As I scroll down, you see all of the different scenarios that are available within our EAP map set. This is the same basin that had that May 2007 event that I briefly showed you in the video. So I can turn on, in this case, the maximum high failure flood depth. That's the probable maximum flood kind of equivalent if you're thinking about FEMA 64 guidelines and terminology. But then I have many other normal high. This is our equivalent in the Corps of Engineers to the sunny day failure. So I can look at flood depths. If I want something more basic, I can look at extents. So I can turn on the maximum high flood extent and the sunny day flood extent at the same time. Or maybe, well, okay, let's say the dam doesn't breach. It holds, the structure operates properly, but we have a significant release from that. Well, I think for the sake of time I won't do that, but you get the idea. I can turn on these various layers, and I can actually change the color coding as well. So let's say I want that flood depth to be displayed a little bit differently. I can come into this tool. This option I'm going to show you is very common for search and rescue type operations. Let's say you're contemplating a National Guard deployment. The question becomes, what kind of emergency response vehicles can operate in these various locations that are flooded. So we key the depths to axle heights of these different types of vehicles. You can also do some customization. So just to show you an example of looking at turning that depth map into an extent map, I could just do that, click save, and then you'd get the red. For the sake of time, I won't do that, but capabilities that everybody's going to have access to. I can get more information about not only this particular layer, so additional metadata will be populated here so that I can understand it, but there's information and reports available that describe these scenarios in pretty significant detail. So I just had to click a login prompt click that you guys didn't see because it was on my other screen, but I can actually pull down these hydraulic modeling reports and consequence assessment reports to share that information with people as well. The last thing I'll mention before I move on to a few examples. Here's what I would need to do, and again, this type of capability will, in about a year from now, be available in the National Inventory of Dams. I can pull down the source data for this depth map. I'm not going to click save because it would take some time, but it's just a simple save operation. Or if I'm in a web mapping type scenario and I just want to display this particular maximum high breach scenario in my web mapping application, say in the state EOC, I can grab the service link from here, which I'm hovering over now, and then paste it into my system of choice so that I don't have to go to the Corps of Engineers website to look at that information. And I've got a live link so that if the dam owner operator updates that scenario, I've got a direct feed to that information in my system. Now I'm going to switch over because current events are always fun to talk about. There's a major hurricane about to make landfall in the Louisiana-Texas border. So the Corps of Engineers is working with the National Water Center now, and we're actively publishing inundation maps based on the forecast of the rainfall event that's going to come from Hurricane Laura. So here's an example of the internal system. And again, I can grab any scenario out of that set of basins that have been modeled for this inland flood event that's about to happen and download the data, or grab a service link and put it over into some other web mapping application. So let's, for the sake of discussion, say I just clicked that button and grabbed that service link. I'm now going to show you the link to the public accessible site that integrates that information. So we're not only showing what I had on the previous screen, but we're seeing the location of major levee systems and these dark red lines, the river gauges, and I believe this is their current, maybe it's their forecast stage, not quite sure. But then we always defer to the National Hurricane Center for storm surge. So this very colorful area that you see in the reds and the yellows and the darker blues and greens, that's where storm surge is driving the risk. So that's coming from the National Hurricane Center. And then again, what we're modeling in the Corps of Engineers is the inland flooding that could be resulting from this event. So again, kind of that concept of the publishing of data, which is something that happens to feed the data system by the dam owner operator or by the Corps water management staff. And then the capabilities within the system that allow you to quickly make that information accessible to a much broader audience. In this case, for this flood event, we're doing it outside of the Corps of Engineers. So that is really about all I had. I'm trying to switch over to something that's hidden by my WebEx control, so give me 1 second. It's going to look weird for just a minute.
And as you do navigate, do you have one more thing, Jason, or I was going to ask you a question that was posed in the chat?
Yeah, we're pretty much at Q&A. I was just switching over to kind of show the state of Nevada within that database, and not a whole lot of existing libraries in the state, but there are a few. If there were any questions about this, and I'll turn it over to see if there are any questions.
Yeah, we'll give Leonard an opportunity to speak and introduce himself on audio. Press *6 to unmute your line, Leonard. And if you're not able to do so, I might just read off your question. I'll give it another couple seconds. Okay. Leonard, welcome.
Yes. How you doing?
Great. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. It's been great. Yeah,
you said you ran into...
Oh, what was that?
You said you'd try to get into the website. You ran into a couple of snags. I was wondering if you could just ask directly your question, and Jason, maybe you can fill us in and remind us again what the rollout looks like next year. So go ahead, Leonard.
Yeah, I didn't know if those sites that you had shown, were available, like the viewer of the portal. I know you said something about those being maybe available later at a later date, but I wasn't sure exactly. I think I didn't write down, so I didn't get exactly what time that the rollout was going to be for that. And I did try to put in, when you were in one of those frames, one of the URLs, and I did get as far as entering like a PIN number, but I didn't have a available PIN number, so I didn't know if I'd gotten into it or not.
Not sure. I tell you what I'll do. So the page I'm showing you right now, That is a public accessible site. It's a very convoluted URL. So I'll just when I get done with the Q&A, I'll post it in the chat so everybody can play with that if they want. And yes, everything else that I demonstrated here is right now stuck behind the Corps of Engineers firewall. So I don't know if you're Corps of Engineers employee or not, but for those of you not in the Corps of Engineers, the rollout of these capabilities for dams tied to the National Inventory of Dams is targeted for November of 2021, and we're going to spend the next year kind of with the socialization and the rollout of those capabilities.
Yeah, I work for the National Weather Service, so I'm not with the Corps.
Okay.
And what about the inundation portal viewer that you were showing there? Is that also Is that also something that will be coming out in the future?
Yes, and actually with the National Weather Service employees, it's liable to come out much sooner than that November 2021 date. So the staff in the National Water Center have full access to this portal already. We have coordination calls every day right now with Hurricane Laura, and so the staff in the Water Center actually will bring our portal up when we're talking about what we're modeling. So there's been some emails with staff at the National Weather Service headquarters over the last few days about what it's going to take to get access to everybody in the Weather Service. So we're just starting to understand kind of technically, the steps we're going to have to take to make that happen, but it is in progress. So I can't tell you an ETA for Weather Service staff to have access, but I hope, I guess I should say, I hope that it will be much sooner than a year from now.
Okay, great. Yeah, I have some. Yeah, we work with, like you said, just as you do. We work with the Water Center as well, and of course, the River Forecast Centers. When the Water Center handles they do some special products for big events like here with Hurricane Laura. So yeah, that's great. Yeah, that was really all. Yeah, that was really my question. I was just curious. It looked like it was some really good stuff, and just wanted to see how soon it would be out to for us to look at.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And Leonard from South Carolina, so you're a little bit closer to hurricane season, and I know that conditions change all across the nation for things. I am going to point out what Jason's illustrating right now is that, we don't have a huge presence in terms of USACE stands inside of the state, the state of Nevada. So I'm really excited, and I see a post from Rachel Oriana, who is the flood risk program manager for the Corps Sacramento District, and is the lead for our liaison lead for the Corps' involvement in Silver Jackets. So Rachel points this out as well, that we're really glad that Silver Jackets makes it possible for us to share this information inside of Nevada for the benefit of folks that wouldn't already interface with us. You'll see that there is one spot up just south of Reno and one that is down in, what is that to the right, lower right, number 4, Jason?
Yeah, so that's saying that we have 4 libraries available. So you actually have 2 dams. These are Los Angeles District projects, Pine Canyon and Matthews Canyon. Pine Canyon is actually, 2 different studies. So there's really one EAP map set for Pine Canyon. And then Meadow Valley River, maybe I'll go to that one just as an example. This is going to show you, it's actually not a great example, but Corps Water Management System is being developed out for this basin. Just doesn't happen to have anything available yet. That's what's saying no spatial data. We go ahead and close that. Here's Matthews Canyon Dam. And this is going to look very much like the Smithville Dam that I already demonstrated, but, just to kind of get to the equivalent product. Definitely a canyon, so, very confined and constrained inundation from these dam failure scenarios, but you get the feel of how that will be presented and available for people to view and access directly from the National Inventory of Dams once we get that deployed a year from now.
It's fantastic. Any other comments, chats, questions, folks that are on? They're using the chat. I'm trying to monitor as best I can. But if we have a couple more minutes before we segue to our last and final. Well, no, not last and final. Second to last presenter. But are there any urgent questions or anything that folks saw in the chat space that they want to draw attention to? Brent, you'll be my ears and eyes and voice on.
Hi, Dave. This is Jennifer Stevens. I just had one question, being that I'm in Louisiana right now. When you were showing on your screen the map of the flood inundation mapping at the bottom of Louisiana, what is that pale blue layer?
Pale blue.
Right, yeah. See how over the southern Louisiana, I'm just curious what that was.
Okay, well, can you see my cursor moving?
I can see your hand.
Okay, yeah, the hand, right. So this area that I'm kind of moving, this boundary right here, that's the surge zone. So when we release this to the public, right, we're incorporating the Hurricane Center's surge estimates as a boundary condition of our inland flood model. So, when we display it publicly, right, we put the Hurricane Center's data over the top. The light blue then is based on the 48-hour or 5-day, depending on how we've run it, either the 48-hour or the 5-day forecast from the Weather Service. That's the estimate of the inland flood potential. So there's a lot of concern right now, right, in western Louisiana, eastern Texas. And so this is actually a modeled simulation of the extent of flooding that could occur from the rainfall.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you again, Jason. Really appreciate you bringing a sort of a USACE data collection nationwide effort and sharing that kind of emerging knowledge. I would encourage folks to introduce yourselves on chat, ask your questions. Maybe, Jason, you can paste that URL that's publicly available so that people can play around with that on the side. But I don't encourage multitasking because I'd like for you to focus your attention on our next speaker, of course. So I'd like to introduce David Serafini, who is also here, Sacramento District, but with the division. Well, correct me if I'm wrong, David, the Dam Safety Production Center. Yep. So I'll let you make your own introduction. I do see your screen, David, and we see the edited version with there you go, there's a full screen version. You're a WebEx expert. So, David, welcome and take it away.
Thanks, Hunter. Can you hear me, Hunter? I guess as an audio check.
Yes, sir. I can hear you.
Awesome. All right. Yeah, thank you very much. First off, thanks for the opportunity today to speak to you, and I've actually learned a lot from the earlier sessions, so I appreciate being part of that today. My name's David Serafini. I'm the Geosciences Branch Chief in the SPD Dam Safety Production Center. I actually reside in Sacramento, California, and I'm here today to speak on Oroville. I actually had the opportunity to be part of both the emergency response and also a role in assistance in the recovery phase of the project. So, this incident that I'll go through today, this Oroville incident, really has shaped dam safety items in terms of spillway design, erodibility of spillways, and also, I think importantly for this conversation, the emergency response. So there's a lot with that. I'm going to try to highlight some of those items, and I'll leave time hopefully at the end here for a Q&A for additional questions. I will also recommend, this is my perspective of it from USACE, just, being embedded with the DWR team in California, but there's a lot of folks we can reach you to or point you to in the state of California, DWR, that obviously were very firsthand in the recovery, the public part of it, the media aspects of it, and I'll touch on a little bit of that towards the end as we go through it. So The Corps really was involved with Oroville through PL 8499 assistance once the issues at the project started to come about. So I'll discuss that as we go through. So a little bit of background. I think a lot of folks are familiar with Oroville. Just a couple key highlights on this slide. Oroville is a very large reservoir. It's California's second largest reservoir, 3.5 million acre feet. And we'll talk about how much of that storage was eaten up during this event until the point where it spilled over the emergency spillway. It's the tallest earth-fill dam in the United States at 770 feet. So you can just imagine what the breach wave of a dam scenario failure would be on this project. Very large. It was built it's not as old as some of the other projects we look at that we're doing rehabs on in the Corps of Engineers. It was built in 1968. And I'll touch on that a little bit because that now is a window of spillways in the Corps that we're looking at in a little bit more detail. But yeah, construction was completed in 1968. And then a couple key elevations. So the emergency spillway crest, and we'll talk more about this, is just keep this number in mind, is 901.0 feet, the elevation. We'll talk about how quickly the reservoir came to that during the incident. So the USACE role, we did not construct, design, or build Oroville Dam or its spillways, but there is federal interest in the project. It is one of our Section 7 type dams, and I'll show a slide of that next. We did furnish funds in the 1960s to build the project to essentially gain 750,000 acre feet of storage for flood control components. So this is just a slide that it's used in the district here. It shows all the projects, and I thought this would be valuable, especially for those in Nevada, to see Sacramento district's projects in comparison to the state of Nevada. You can see most of the Sacramento projects are within the state of California. We do have a few that go out towards Utah and one in Colorado. Some of those are under a Section 7 jurisdiction. There are a number of other projects in the state, and I probably should have included that slide for SPL, our Los Angeles district office, in and around the southern part of Nevada, as you guys know, and Las Vegas. There's a number of dry type dams that are in that vicinity. Next slide here. Get it to advance. There we go. So some key project features just to keep in mind. There's really like three areas here I'll cover. There's the Oroville Dam and Spillway. Move one thing on my screen. Okay. So the Oroville Dam, actually, can you see my cursor?
Yes, sir.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Yeah, so Oroville Dam, there's the main dam, which again is over 700 feet tall. The project actually also includes several other auxiliary dams, which when you compare to the main dam, they don't seem large, but there are large structures. They're several hundred feet tall as well, and they're not shown on this photo. But there's other parts of the facility that during this incident essentially saw their first, I won't say first filling, but their pool of record for inspection. So there were a number of things going on during this event, not just the issues with the spillway. Of course, there's the flood control outlet, which is the damaged concrete spillway section that I think everybody's probably pretty aware of by now. The emergency spillway, which essentially led to overflow and then down the ravine that's shown here. So that's the Oroville Dam and Spillway. There's also the Hyatt Powerhouse, which sits on the left abutment of the main dam. It's a fairly large power generating facility, and it's the primary outlet for the dam. So the primary outlet has its flow conveyance through the powerhouse, and I'll talk a little bit about that towards the end because there were some issues with the blockage of the Feather River and essentially the tailwater increases and inabilities to release water at certain points during the event. Then there's, and I'm not going to discuss this much here, but the Thermalito after bay. So there's a power canal, 4-bay pumping generation plant. There's a bunch of stuff, infrastructure downstream as part of the State Water Project. So the flood control outlet itself, again, this is their primary outlet. The main outlet works on this facility is in the order of 10. I don't have the number in front of me. I think it's 10 to 20,000 CFS through the Hyatt power plant, which is, a very small outlet in comparison to a reservoir that's got 3.5 million acre feet behind it, as well as, 700 plus feet ahead. So the primary outlet, which has been used ever since the project was constructed, is this flood control outlet structure. And it doesn't flow every year. It flows with pretty good frequency, though, between years. It has a release of up to 300,000 CFS, and it's routinely seen 150,000 CFS up until 2017. There's been maintenance over time. There's a photo in 2013. There's been repairs, as you typically would see in a spillway, especially one, or I'd say even an outlet works where you have frequent flows. There's maintenance required, joints that need to be sealed, and so on. That's gone on historically with this project. And you can see the photo on the right is a photo taken the year before with flow discharge coming through the dendrites and into the Feather River. So then came 2017. So in 2017, it ended up ultimately resulting as one of the wettest years we've had on record. And, and as we tracked, going back in looking back in perspective on this, as we tracked it against some of our wetter years, and I'll show a graphic on that, it was wetter at almost every moment in time in terms of the amount of precip and, more importantly, the amount of inflow that came in. What was evident was that, the inflows that were predicted from our water management folks and other folks that look at this from the DWR standpoint in terms of what the forecast and events would have given us was always greater. We always had more inflow, and this is a very complicated watershed with, a decent amount of rain on snow, and with the elevation bands, if you get warmer precip, you can get much greater inflows. And we saw that this year. You'll see in this graphic in particular, the bulk of the event was in the very early part of February. So starting really after the 4th of February, we started seeing significant inflows on the order of 120,000, 140,000, and we did have a peak up to 190,000 CFS on the 9th. And then on this graphic, you'll also see the outflows. With the inflows, of course, they were ramping up outflows, and we'll talk about point 1 here. This is where we had the incident occur. On the next slide, I'll discuss that, which caused a ramp down in outflows to survey, damage, to inspect before it was able to be put back into service, ultimately to be brought back up again to try to pass these events as they came in. And you'll see it wasn't one event. We had several events stacked on each other. There was an event that came in really on the 7th, one that came in towards the end of the 8th, one that came in on the 9th, and that was the largest one. So it was a ratcheting kind of effect of loading on this reservoir, which really had to make for very quick decision making on the project. So this is the graphic I mentioned before. So this is just a graphic that shows some of the wetter years in this watershed and some of the drier years. You can see some of the drier years, we get about 19 inches of total precip in this watershed. One of the wetter years, or the wettest year really on record prior to 2017, was 88.5 inches in this watershed. And in 2016, 2017, we were at 94.7 inches. And I guess the main point of this graph is this year started out wet from the onset. We tracked basically on the wettest year. And then as we got, as I mentioned, into that February timeframe, we had some pretty significant pulses that drove it well into the wettest range on record. And those were the ones that were really difficult to deal with from an inflow standpoint. And then I'll just point out one other item on here. So 2017, in February, we already had 60 inches of rain 5 feet of rain essentially in the watershed. And I'll talk a little bit about the recovery later, but this project had to have a very quick construction cycle in order to put it back into operation for 2018. And fortunately, there was only 20 inches of rain to that point in 2018 after the event, which made the ability to do the recovery efforts a lot more straightforward. So let's get into the incident itself. So between 3 and 7 February, this is again on that, there's a red box shown here, kind of the cycle of where that falls with the inflows. That's when we started seeing an increase in inflows on this facility. As a result, the flood control outlet was increased from 20,000 to 54,000 CFS during that, essentially to match and to start drawing the reservoir down, really to keep up with inflows as much as possible. At a point there, as you can see, inflows exceeded outflow, so we started surcharging in the reservoir. They released up to 54,500, and at that point in time, on the 7th of February, DWR discovered a plume of dirty water in the spillway flow. So the photo on the left essentially is right when that occurred, and they lost the slab section as well as ultimately a section of the left wall or underneath the left wall that gave way, and a fairly large void, as you can see on the right, manifested. So they cut releases back to 5,200 CFS to inspect at this point. Obviously, they encountered this large crater, and at this point, the water surface reached 860. So again, just a note, the spillway crest is 901, so we're still 41 feet below, the emergency spillway flow event. So just a graphic here of what that looked like. I think a lot of folks, that didn't get a chance to go on site firsthand, maybe didn't get a sense of the scale of this project. And I'll show some of that as we go through the slides. The scale of the amount of erosion and devastation of the spillway is immense. So you can see here during the inspection, folks went in safely, tied off to look at the amount of damage and whether or not this was going to be safe to allow flows over it. So on the 8th of February, that's actually when the Corps got involved. We were called in to provide technical assistance. Our EOC was activated. The flood control outlet worsened. They did some test flows up to 30,000 CFS just to see if the spillway, basically the rate of erosion with additional flow coming over the spillway. Because again, we're in the middle of inflow events. And if you can see that on the red bar, you can see the amount of inflow coming in at that time. They knew they needed to release water. And I guess, one thing here, again, to take away is this isn't happening with, days and a week of notice. This is every day. There is every data, every hour, every minute, there were critical decisions being made at this point in time. And I think that's one thing when you're in the middle of one of these emergencies in planning, and I'll talk about this at the end, but having the right communication protocols, the right outlets to media, all that set up in your EAPs is really critical so that you can just roll them out effectively because things move very fast, especially in an incident like this. So at that point, I mentioned that larger than expected inflows peak at 190,000, actually just over 190,000 CFS on the 9th of February. Again, I think the forecast was less than that, and it came in much greater. At that point, we deployed Sacramento folks to DWR's office to provide technical assistance for some of the decision-making with DWR. On the 10th of February, the spillway flow was increased to 45,000 CFS, so that's the flood control outlet flow. And then SPK was actually ready to mobilize at that point for on-site assistance. And then on the 11th of February, I think everybody probably remembers the graphics of this. That's the day where, based on the amount of inflow and the lack really of being able to get a significant outflow in the 150, 200,000 CFS range, that's when water came up to the emergency spillway and flowed over the crest of the emergency spillway. The spill itself was over the 1,700-foot wide OG weir and was only a flow depth of about 1.5 feet, and about right around 6,000 to 12,000 CFS came over that spillway. And I'll show some photos of the erosion just firsthand of what happened just under only a 6,000 to 12,000 CFS event. I guess one other note, to get to the spillway, the emergency spillway, I talked about the elevation change. That's where the reservoir had gone from elevation 860 to elevation 901, which essentially was around 790,000 acre-feet of reservoir fill over just about 7 days. Actually, I think it might even be closer to 5 days. And that it's pretty amazing to think that, especially when there was still an outflow of how much capacity was eaten up during this event. So on the next day, and I'll get into this, this is kind of when we got involved on site. But this is just a photo here of the spillway, the outlet chute again on the left, the damage, and then this is prior to, obviously, the emergency spillway flowing on the left. And then once the emergency spillway was essentially initiated with the reservoir elevation rising over 901, this is the erosion that took place. Let me go make one more note on that previous slide, actually. So one thing to note, these things always happen at the wrong time. So the spillway, emergency spillway flow started at 8 p.m., the first flow of the spillway. And obviously, this time of year, that was pitch dark. And so it was in the darkness of the night when the spillway started flowing. And it flowed essentially for 24 hours. It ended essentially at 8:30 p.m. the next day. So it had about 24 hours of overflow. Again, about 1.5 feet over the emergency spillway crest is what they saw. They increased at that point the flood control outlet to 100,000 cubic feet per second, and that was really to keep, after they could see how much damage was occurring to the emergency spillway, they really wanted to prevent that, so they started ramping up outflows out of the flood control outlet to decrease overflow of the emergency spillway. And also on that same day, that's when the Butte County Sheriff ordered the mandatory evacuation downstream. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, what that meant in the next slide. So that's the 12th of February. So at that point in time, we have an evacuation order. We increased the flood control outlets and flood control structure to 100,000 CFS in order to really try to minimize the amount of overflow. Fortunately, at that point in time, we didn't have another spike in inflow. We were lucky that the pulse of those storms had passed, and we didn't know that, obviously. We were still thinking, anticipating we were going to have more. This is the wetter part of the year for the state. So on the 13th of February, that's when we deployed folks from USACE, from the Sacramento district, in emergency response. So this was during the evacuation order for Butte County. And I'll tell you personally, I still remember, I'll never get the memory out of my mind of driving up, through the valley up to Orville, through the evacuation zone, past all the sheriff, road closures, and then driving by essentially cities like Marysville and others that were completely lit up like it was normal business and not a soul. It was an eerie feeling, and I'll never get that out of my mind of driving into the evacuation zone to Orville. It really grounds you in terms of the perspective and the magnitude of our projects, our dam safety projects, and risk they pose to the public, and making sure we do things right. So that was the 13th of February. The 15th of February, we also began on the USACE end supplying other dam safety experts to come in to understand, how we could get this facility back operational in order to get through the current flood season. So one point to note here, so when they called for the evacuation order, there weren't many inundation maps available for Oroville. Really, the primary maps that were available were for full dam breach. And full dam breach for Oroville, if you can think about that at a reservoir that's, got about 700 plus feet ahead behind it and 3.5 million acre feet, that's a very large inundation map for a sunny day, essentially full pool scenario behind the dam. Unfortunately, that inundation mapping really wasn't the right mapping for this incident. I mean, this incident was really a component failure of a feature that had a very low likelihood, it turns out, to lead to a dam breach scenario. So it's difficult when you're in that perspective, and this is where I think we've changed as an industry. I think everybody has learned from this project worldwide probably about how to better develop inundation maps for component type failures, areas where you can have an accidental or not to say accidental, but an unexpected release of water. Also, what's important is just the sensitivity in these studies to warning time, evacuation routes, where folks need to go. I think in areas where you have large potential breach scenarios, and even on top of that, large populations. I know we run into this with some of our Southern California projects that we're working on now. It's really important that emergency managers know how to get folks out. It's not just so much about the floodplain, the depth of floodplain. It's really about, thinking of, across watersheds, especially if more than one watershed is affected. How do you get folks out of there safely through the infrastructure? And in some cases, it might be better to have some folks shelter in place, depending on the scenarios. I know you guys go through that as floodplain managers and in the evaluation of these. But this was an eye-opener in terms of not having sufficient mapping for the incident we had in front of us. Now, just a couple photos here just to show the scale. So this is during the emergency response initially, when the evacuation order was still in place. This is just what the exposed bedrock erosion looked like before concrete and riprap was placed over it. You can see the amount of erosion. You can see the variability of the rock. Very large caverns were eroded. And as I always say, water always wins, and you'll see that with the concrete and what it did to some of the concrete at this facility. Immediately, DWR worked to essentially protect this area. They were concerned about the potential of having to use the emergency spillway again in 2017, given the damage to the flood control outlet that had already taken place. So there was a pretty intense effort to grout and place riprap in these areas. And I'm just showing photos here of what was exposed that essentially got covered with riprap. All the jointing of the rock, the weathering of the rock, a lot of it was more soil-like, especially near the surface. In addition to some of the repairs, and here's some of the riprap going in that got grouted in one of the photos here. This is, again, below the emergency spillway. This is immediately, essentially, after the evacuation, and in part during the evacuation still, some of these photos. There were also repairs made to the flood control outlet. So in a lot of ways, the outlet was essentially hardened on its downstream extent of the upper portion. So this, again, is the upper portion of the flood control outlet chute, but the downstream extent of it, and downstream of this, obviously, is where the big erosional feature developed. You can see here shotcrete was placed. Many anchors were placed really to lock the last couple slabs in such that flow could pass over this and not manifest upstream with additional erosion. And then again, this is another photo where water, water one in this case on the upper right, you'll see water really was able to take some fairly large walls, large slab sections, and just move them like they were nothing, especially with the amount of reinforcement that was in place. And this was built in the late 60s, so there was substantially more rebar than a project and facility that we see in, something built in the 40s or 50s. Still, once the water was able to penetrate and get into the foundation, the anchors just were not able to hold it back. And you can see the photo, the larger photo here, just a good sense of scale. You can see how high, in fact, on the right side of that is the main dam, the top of the main dam. You can see the height of the control structure to the river bottom. And then take a look at the dendrites here, and you'll see a person against those just for scale here in a little bit. What this erosional event did do, it did help in some ways in the recovery. They actually had a hydraulic excavation essentially by this event to competent rock, and you can see the more competent rock that was left for them to enact the recovery part. One other aspect, I think is the last aspect of the emergency, there was a significant amount of erosion into the river, into the Feather River, which caused a lot of issues with just outlet flows. And again, at this point, flood control outlet was out of service at points because of the damage here. The emergency spillway was being repaired and only is used when the reservoir, exceeds 901. So the other outlet is the Hyatt Outlet Works and Hyatt Power Plant. And there were issues with operability of the plant because the tailwater had risen due to a blockage in the river. So you can see the amount of material, over 1 million yards of material was deposited into the river and then ultimately was dredged during the event in order for the tailwater to be lowered, in order for the river to be able to outflow back into the Thermalito afterbase system. And then this is just a photo in March of the flood control outlet back in operation again. This is to draw the reservoir down after emergency repairs in order for the reservoir to be drawn down enough such that the recovery effort could start. So on the recovery, these are my last couple slides here. The recovery essentially is a replacement of the service chute or service spillway flood control outlet. It mimics the exact dimensions, orientation of the original outlet that was there, but with enhanced features, obviously. So there's a significantly increased number of anchors that went in as part of that recovery, a number of drains that were added, and an improved drain system as well for the under drains. The structural section is significantly thicker. In fact, I think on average it's about 7 feet in thickness. It has 2 mats of reinforcement instead of 1 mat of reinforcement. So it's a pretty substantially improved spillway chute as a repair. And then one thing, the note, it was a major endeavor for DWR to go down this path for the recovery. They knew they needed to start early. They had a year essentially to have the facility reconstructed for the next flood season. So with that, they used a phased approach for contract modifications, and they took over an entire floor in DWR in their main resources building with a dedicated team, and it was the right thing to do in order to get things moving. Again, rapid response. It was amazing to see the progress of this project on the site visits I got to go on between May and October in order to restore it before 1 November in the flood season. And this is a site in 2017 of the facility. And then I think the last slide is the site, I think, earlier this year with some restoration still taking place. So I guess in kind of closing, just some thoughts on this. I mean, this case, I believe this incident at least really kind of shaped all of dam safety and our awareness of one, spillways. We've looked hard as an agency in USACE at spillways, and spillways especially that are similar to this type of scenario and built during about the same time frame. It also, I think, gave us a sense of awareness or increased awareness of the importance of EAPs, inundation maps, really for planning, communication of all of that, and not just internal communication, but external communication in order to be ready for an event, which I hope we never see an event of this magnitude again. This was a very large event. It also, I think, one of the other things that I've realized in this project, as well as others that we've been involved with, especially with levee scenarios in the state of California, it's really important to work with public affairs ahead of time and really have the right communication set up with public affairs for, communicating both the EAP aspects, and then I think, inundation maps are part of that now, and I'm glad as an agency we're going to be able to release more of those. We heard that in the previous presentation, that's going to be more widely disseminated. But I think it's important that public affairs works closely with emergency managers to make sure that messaging is together, and also the right messaging is put into place so things are consistent in the event that an emergency occurs. I think those are really important aspects. And then I'll highlight the silver jackets. I know that, and I don't have all the intel, but there's been some major pushes on silver jackets down in Southern California, in particular on Whittier Narrows, where we have roughly 1.4 million people living below the Whittier Narrows facility. It's a USACE facility. And there's been a pretty large effort looking at non-structural scenarios for risk reduction there. So I can, if anybody's interested in that, send me an email and I can point you to the right direction. If you guys don't already have those contacts, there's been a lot of real good work, positive work that's come out of some silver jacket efforts down in the LA area. So with that, that's all I have. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. I learned a lot from the previous talks today. So again, this is just my summary of Orville. I would definitely appreciate or encourage you to reach out to DWR. There's probably many lessons learned and things that you can pull from the state of California on this project.
David, this is great. I really do appreciate it. In the interest of time, I'm going to shift it really quickly to Keith Conrad, who's our closing speaker. But I do want you to stay on and share your thoughts on the side chat. And folks, if you have comments or questions, please chat to David. And I want to say thank you again for being here and sharing your knowledge of that real life scenario. Keith, can we hear from you?
Yep. Can you hear me?
Marvelous. Yes, sir, we can. I think you have the presenter ball. You can either share your slides through WebEx, or if you want to share your screen, looks like you're sharing your screen. Keith Conrad's going to close us out here with how do you take this knowledge and go forward. So take it away, Keith. Thank you.
All right. My name is Keith Conrad. I work for the Dam Safety program within the Nevada Division of Water Resources. And out of the 3 people in dam safety, I'm Keith number 2. So you got to miss out on Keith number 1 today. So anyway, what I'm going to talk about today is as far as the Nevada Division of Water Resources goes, and dam safety with EAPs and tabletop exercises as well. Where do we go from here? Unfortunately, due to the situation that's happening around the world today, obviously things aren't how we want them, so we adapt and overcome, and we do things like this. So going forward, our plans, we plan to continue combining emergency action plans and maps into easy-to-use binders for emergency managers, and provide yearly updates for those. And going forward, we hope to add to this low-hazard inundation maps to the binders, because currently they are not required to have inundation maps, and also add large-scale maps electronically with our updates, and as well add our most recent dam safety ratings for each of the high and significant hazard dams, so emergency managers can look at their the dams within their jurisdiction and see, well, it's a high hazard dam that's in very poor shape. Maybe we should be worried about that. Additionally, we want to continue to analyze watersheds and reservoirs and spillways to calculate maximum allowable safe inflows into reservoirs to help owners and operators operate their dams safely. We see we have a lot of old dams in Nevada and small spillways and reservoirs that may have silted in, and so their capacity is drastically reduced, as well as the spillway capacity is probably not adequate to today's standards. So that's something that, as our office hopes to investigate further. Additionally, we're looking at making changes to the Nevada Revised Statutes and the Nevada Administrative Code to clarify EAP requirements, and we're looking at creating EAP templates and checklists to help producers of emergency action plans meet our requirements. And we need to start thinking about breach scenarios for an inundation mapping. As we've seen in David's previous and many of the previous presentations, a sunny day breach may not be appropriate for a given area. Maybe the hazard will be a less than 100-year event with rain on snow, and downstream your river's already at a 100-year flood stage. And so we need to start thinking about what's an appropriate breach scenario for the inundation mapping. Additionally, we're looking at potentially determining flow rates at which downstream areas start to flood and start to impact structures, residences, et cetera. And so we can look and see, if a dam opens their principal spillway at 3,000 CFS, what's going to happen downstream? The dam may not be failing, but we may still be damaging to communities downstream. We are looking at possibly establishing requirements for tailings dam inundation mapping, and to more accurately show what would happen if a tailings dam did fail. We have, as Chris had mentioned earlier, we have many tailings dams within the state, and most of them are low hazard, but we do have some very large tailings facilities, and so it's something to think about. And we're looking at possibly requiring inundation map timeline videos. I think Greg Richards' example showed that pretty clearly at what a tool that inundation video shows. Do you have islands that are going to get cut off, and maybe those need to be evacuated first? And I think as far as the emergency managers goes and the evacuation areas, that's truly an incredible tool. And then we are also looking at standardizing inundation map details and callouts. If it's schools, if it's shopping centers, churches, hospitals and other facilities, we would like to standardize. If there's anything in the inundation zone, those need to be identified. And so going forward, how can we help the emergency managers that are going to be dealing with these EAPs? We want to know how we can help you with regards to dam safety. That's why we're here. And we want to know how we can make EAPs for dams better for the emergency managers, and what do you want to see, and how do you want them presented, and we can also help put on tabletop exercises. Also, it's helpful to know what dams are in your jurisdiction, and know what dams have EAPs and where the EAPs are located, and to review those EAPs on file and provide feedback to our office. If this doesn't make sense, what you have, we want to know what we can do to help make these EAPs make sense. And I think, if we can standardize the formatting and the layout and the callouts, et cetera, that would be a huge step on making it easier for everyone to use the EAPs more effectively. And exercise your EAPs. Ask dam owners to put on a tabletop exercise. And like I said in the previous slide, we can help out. We can help facilitate those. And then we want to work with dam owners to help prepare EAPs. As Chris had mentioned in the first or second presentation, we are missing some EAPs, and because we recognize that they are expensive to generate, and possibly we're looking at ways that we can make it more accessible for them to generate those EAPs. Also, communicate with the Nevada Division of Water Resources regarding questions, issues, or anything dam-related. Like I said before, we are here to support the public, emergency managers, et cetera, as far as having a safe dam environment in Nevada. And how can you help yourself? Notice when downstream conditions of a dam change or will change. This can change hazard ratings, inundation areas, inundation hazards, et cetera. If a development gets built below a low hazard dam, well, that probably will change the classification of that dam to significant or high, which would then probably mean that a dam was designed with maybe minimal amount of spillway flow now is not going to be adequate to not flood out that community. So we need to know when that happens, and the people that live there know that that's happening. And also we can require an owner to update or create a new EAP to reflect the downstream condition changes and create a new EAP and a new inundation map also. Also, you can help familiarize yourself with what might cause dams in your area to be stressed and or fail. The dam condition, and in this case we're looking at a dam that failed because it had unauthorized modifications. And if you can see my cursor, you can see this is just different views of the same embankment, but this dam for years and years had gotten a poor rating for rodent holes. And ultimately that did not make this dam fail, but you can see that the condition wasn't great, and they made modifications, and within a year it had failed. And also familiarize yourself with hazards in your area. This is a detention basin principal spillway that we're looking at in the Las Vegas Valley, and this was after a wildfire event, and the monsoon season that occurred thereafter brought down a lot of vegetation and silt, etc., that almost completely clogged this spillway, which could have been potentially a very bad situation, especially if I think this dam is over a mile long, and there's homes directly downstream. And also be cognizant of what the dam conditions in your area are. And like I had mentioned earlier, one of the things we hope to get across to the emergency managers is, these are your dams in your area, the hazard rating, as well as the condition of the dam. Obviously, this dam isn't going to retain a lot of water, but it's good to know the conditions of the dams in your area. Here's a compromised spillway in the very tile slide. This is the principal conduit through the dam, and it obviously has failed to some extent. And again, getting back to southern Nevada, monsoons, and this is within 1 year of monsoonal rains in this area. And this gauge you're looking at, this little block here, is actually the 10-foot gauge on the reservoir elevation, and you can see that enough rain has come in and eroded and silted into the basin to obviously reduce its capacity. And dam condition again, this dam is probably not being used, which is a good deal, because those are how you open and close the principal spillway. And looking at this dam, it may not necessarily fail and cause any harm to anyone, but anyone that goes to this dam and is hanging out on the dam does, face a huge risk of death just being there. And again, getting back to, this is a Washoe Lake Dam this year. Actually, two of the dams at Washoe Lake. The one on the upper left is the upstream dam that was built by critters, and the lower right is the actual dam with that has been failing since 2017, and that is an 8-foot pole right there that you can see about 3.5 feet sticking out of the erosion. And also getting to high flows, rain on snow events, do often cause damage to dams. This is a high flow event. I forget the year, but you can see afterwards what happened to the apron below it. The dam obviously did not fail, but a portion of the dam did fail. And this is looking at a auxiliary spillway of a dam in eastern Nevada that failed due to snow melt and a lack of communication. And this is a second in a series of 2 dams, like we saw in the Michigan dam failures. One dam failing or one dam operation has an effect on the lower dam for sure. And this is the result of it, the spillway erosion, or actually as it happened. And so just a reminder that dam failures occur almost yearly in Nevada and every part of the state for any number of reasons. And the Nevada Division of Water Resources is here to support you. And I want to thank everyone for attending this webinar, and to all our presenters and the Army Corps of Engineers and Nevada Silver Jackets. And that is the end. And I'll hand this back off to Hunter, and we can do question session. And again, thank you, everyone.
Keith, thank you so much. I really do appreciate that. Bringing it all back home. This is featuring the state of Nevada, and it is for the state of Nevada primarily because the Nevada Silver Jackets is the team that hosted this. So I do hope that it does present opportunities for discussion for our community, both emergency managers and dam owners and others. I do see some chats coming in, and that is fantastic. Please do kind of chat your feedback before you take off. I'm proud to say that I took a little poll, and we still had 85 folks on the call a minute ago, and that means that you've stayed with us through the whole morning, or our morning, the afternoon for some of you in the East. And I want to say thank you for that. The recording that you have it says it's recording, and bottom line is I just am experimenting with the recording of these kinds of presentations. So I can't make a commitment to you that, tomorrow the recording will be made available freely. It's a tricky kind of thing. Basically, the audio is recorded separately from the video, but I'll say that all of these presentation materials are available, and I'll point it out to you because I'll share my screen as we close out. And that is, golly, I was surfing around because I was so excited by David's presentation. Here at nevadafloods.org, which is thankfully a spot that's easy to remember. We did actually put all the presentations up here. So nevadafloods.org is where you can go to reach back to get that. There's also where you can go to download the Flood Fighter Nevada game if you want to teach other folks about how to manage dams and levees. It's a great way to learn, educational simulation for you, otherwise known as a video game. I did have a team building or networking thing for you, and that networking thing was to get the distance award. And so the last thing I'll do as we close out is to share a little image, a snip that I took when I was watching Jason Sheely's presentation. And if I can pull that up right here, I will share with you my snip of this map, which will double as a annotation tool. You all have annotation now, and as you depart, if you will circle where you're from, I believe that Donna gets the distance award, but if somebody says they're further away than Donna, and let's just say further away than Reno, and so here we are, let's just say roughly there. As you leave, anything you could say in chat to say thanks or goodbye. We really do appreciate it. We're coming up on our 12 o'clock hour, which is the allotted time we had for the workshop. And I will press stop on the recording right now as people are populating this and maybe departing. So I'll end the recording here, but then stay on until the last person wants to leave. I would entertain opportunity for discussion at this point.
conference recording has stopped.
And